Sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't she
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others.
Hello, welcome to the Avram Davidson universe. I am John Emery Coleman, your host, and it's been a hot minute, hasn't it? Now, since my last interview, we've been searching high and low for folks to interview about Avram's work, and this week we have a doozy. We have Joshua Begley, a man with a PhD in literature and criticism from the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He currently teaches creative writing at Full Sail University. He was the course director and a professor of mine. And his specifics are pretty interesting. Horror, mystery, and suspense. With that pedigree, we've decided to take a look at Revolver, one of my favorite short stories I read from Avram, an incredible noir about the beating heart of a city and how folks turn beautiful buildings into rundown flop houses. Now, let me get Joshua on the horn. Dr. J, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Excellent. Oh, wonderful. Can't complain. So, I've already introduced you.
hmm
What are you working on these days?
Well, right now I'm kind of between projects. This is um, this is like the worst time of the year at Full
Oh,
Sail,
yeah.
and so there's just not enough time in the day and not enough caffeine to get everything done that I want. But I've got a few
Oh, I hear
stories
that.
percolating.
Oh, that's wonderful.
hmm
Anything you're willing to share, or is that all under wraps?
Eh, Kind of all under. Well, I will say one thing. I actually missed the deadline for this. There was this call for submissions for this anthology based around the Greek goddess Circe, the one from the
Oh,
Odyssey.
yeah.
And so I started writing this story. I think it's pretty good. Unfortunately, I got really sick and I wasn't able to finish it by the deadline. So I am going to
Mhm.
still finish it, and then I'm just going to have to shop around for some place that'll accept it.
Oh, excellent. I had the same thing happen to me. There was a sci-fi and fantasy submission for an anthology series, and just like that, I got horribly sick right before to the point where I couldn't sit up for a
Oh,
week.
oh Lord, that's not good.
It's rough, but hey, that's how it goes. It's always around deadlines when something decides to hit you in the back of the head.
Oh yeah.
So, if you haven't had experience with Avram prior, I don't believe you did.
No, I didn't.
Uh, have you gotten into any other pulps from that era?
Well, that's the funny thing is that I am all about the pulps from this era.
Oh yeah.
Um, I mean, one of my favorite authors, Harlan Ellison, who cut his teeth in
Hmm.
this general era, and I was when I was reading the story, not to jump too far ahead, Avram's style and sensibility reminded me a lot of Gerald Kirsch. And
Mm.
so
Yeah.
it's weird that he kind of flew under my radar, but I absolutely want to read more after this.
It was the same thing. I had read a bunch of Avram stories, but I hadn't remembered the name until I came in to host here.
hmm
But I had remembered reading some of his stories in Flashing Swords, and gosh, his sensibilities, his type of writing, even though it evolves past the sci-fi and fantasy, it keeps that same kind of pulpy punch to it.
Yeah.
Incredible pacing.
Yes, very much so. And I could see him kind of also on the same lines as like, especially if he wrote Sword and Sorcery, like on the lines of maybe, I don't know, Clark Ashton Smith or Fritz
Mhm.
Leiber, where they're kind of the more urbane Sword and Sorcery.
Absolutely. He has a series, the Virgil Magus series, or Magus, depending on your pronunciation, but
hmm
it covers the Roman poet Virgil as
Yeah,
a wizard.
I really want to read
And
that.
They are incredibly verbose stories. They are so well written. We did one on Virgil and the Caged Bird a few months ago, and that story is just so dense.
Mhm.
Avram's writing style is heavily verbose, very heady, and I really dig that. It makes a 6-page short story feel like 32 pages.
Just a bit, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's not a bad thing at all. I really dig that. I know some people are not super into that heady type of writing, but I don't know. There's some kind of joy to it. There any stories that this reminds you of from your own work?
Not necessarily. Well, actually, I was thinking about it a little bit, and it does remind me a little bit of some of the stuff that I used to write in my master's program when I was still kind of learning.
Mm,
Um, Not necessarily in the content, but more in that I was really focused back then on, for lack of a better term, the vibe of the writing and kind of
mm,
creating this immersive experience. And I was less interested in plot at the time. Was really one of my weaknesses, actually. And so I would really be focused on character and vibe and the writing itself. And I noticed some similarities with Avram, except
mm.
that he actually does have plot. But it's deceptive. Like he's really good at kind of weaving that in without overloading the writing. Like the writing seems to take precedent, but at the same time, everything comes together so well at the end, at least in this story, that it was really kind of incredible. And I feel like that's what I was trying to do, but I just did not have the chops to do it then.
Absolutely. It reminds me a lot of the I don't even know what you would call them. I guess urban exploration films of Ralph
Yes,
Bakshi.
yes.
Uh, and those films have so little plot, but they're incredibly dense with characterization. And I don't know, this kind of spoke to that same sensibility,
Hmm.
except not as vulgar.
Yes,
Bakshi was a wild guy. But all right, let's go ahead and give it a listen.
absolutely.
Revolver, introduction by Bill Pronzini. When Revolver was first published in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine in 1962, editor Frederick Dane blurbed it in part as a kind of roundelay in prose and a bitter, ironic slice of life in the raw. A perfectly apt description as far as it goes, but it neglects to mention another vital element of the story: its understated and mordant wit. Humor plays a role in all of Avram's crime fiction, just as it does in his science fiction and fantasy tales. It was a central facet of his mindset and his prose style. In some stories, the humor is broad, farcical, laugh-out-loud funny. In others, such as Revolver, it is subtle, and because of its subtlety, even more caustic. Read carefully his descriptions of Mr. Edward Mason's slumlord, of the tenants who inhabit Mason's old brownstone houses, of the other denizens of the inner-city neighborhood in which the brownstones stand a-moldering. The descriptions won't generate laughter, but they will produce wry smiles, and at the same time make you feel just a little uncomfortable. This kind of humor was an Avram specialty, the quiet kind, with an edge and an attitude. Revolver is one of several stories in the Avram oeuvre, both mysteries and fantasies, that remind me of another writer whose work I admire, Gerald Kirsch. Each was his own person and his own writer, but it seems to me that they shared a similar, slightly skewed worldview, a similar passion for oddball characters and situations, and that the humor which infuses their work is similarly acidulous and knife-edged. I wonder if Avram knew Kirsch. If he did, I think they must have enjoyed each other's company. I wondered, too, what a Davidson-Kirsch collaboration might have been like. Something pretty wonderful, to be sure. Something to create both a smile and a faint but pervasive unease, and to linger long in the memory. Something like Revolver, perhaps.
Revolver There was a Mr. Edward Mason who dealt in real estate. His kind of real estate consisted mainly of old brownstone houses into which Mr. Mason crammed a maximum number of tenants by turning each room into a single apartment. Legally, this constituted increasing available residence space, or some similar phrase. As a result of this deed of civic good, Mr. Mason was enabled to get tax rebates, rent increases which were geometrically rather than arithmetically calculated, and a warm glow around his heart. Mr. Mason's tenants were a select group, hand-picked, one might say, to use a phrase favored in other facets of the real estate profession, that his holdings were restricted. He didn't care for tenants who had steady employment. You might think this was odd of him, but that would be because you didn't know the philanthropic cast of Mr. Mason's mind. He favored the lame, the halt, and the blind. He preferred the old and the feeble. He had no scruples, far from it, against mothers without marriage licenses. And his kind-heartedness was rewarded. For after all, employment, no matter how steady, can sometimes be terminated, and then rent cannot be paid. A landlord who can't collect rent is a landlord who can't meet his own expenses. In short, a landlord who is bound to go out of business. In which case it follows that he is a landlord who can no longer practice philanthropy. Therefore, Mr. Mason would be obliged to evict such a tenant in order to protect his other tenants. But, owing to his care, foresight, and selectivity, he had no such tenants. Not any more. No, sir. All his tenants at the time our account begins were in receipt of a steady income not derived from employment. Welfare checks come in regularly, and so do old age assistance checks, state aid checks, and several other variety of checks, more or less unknown to the average citizen, and may he never have to know of them from the recipient's point of view. That is our prayer for him. The average citizen whose tax dollar supplies said checks. Then, too, people who earn their own income are inclined to take a high-handed attitude toward landlords. They seem to think that the real estate investor has nothing better to do with his income than to lavish it on fancy repairs to his property. But a tenant whose soul has been purified by long years as the recipient of public charity is a tenant who is less troublesome, whose tastes are less finicking, who is in no position to carry on about such res naturae as rats, mice, roaches, crumbling plaster, leaky pipes, insufficient heat, dirt, rot, and the like. Is it not odd, then, that after a term of years of being favored by the philanthropic attentions of Mr. Mason and similarly minded entrepreneurs, the neighborhood was said to have gone down? It could not really be, could it, that garbage, for instance, was collected less frequently than in other sections of town, or that holes in the streets and sidewalks were not repaired as quickly as in better neighborhoods? Surely it was a mere coincidence that these things were so, if indeed they were so at all. And anyway, didn't the city make up for it by providing more protection? Weren't patrol cars seen on the streets thereabouts more often than elsewhere? Weren't policemen usually seen on the streets in congenial groups of 3, to say nothing of plainclothesmen? This being the case, it was disconcerting for Mr. Mason to acknowledge that crime seemed to be on the increase in the neighborhood where he practiced his multifold benevolences. But no other conclusion seemed possible. Stores were held up, apartments burglarized, cars broken into, purses snatched, people mugged. It was almost enough to destroy one's faith in human nature. Finally, there was no other choice but for Mr. Mason to secure a revolver and a license for same. Being a respectable citizen, a taxpayer, and one with a legitimate reason to go armed, the necessity to protect himself and the collection of his tenants' rents, he had no difficulty in obtaining either. Among Mr. Mason's tenants was a Mrs. Richards. She was quite insistent, whenever the matter was raised, though it was never raised by Mr. Mason, who was totally indifferent to such items, that Mrs. was no mere courtesy title. She had indeed been married to Mr. Richards, and she had a snapshot of Mr. Richards to prove it. The wedding may have occurred in North Carolina, or perhaps in South Carolina. Nor did she recall the town or country where the happy event took place. Mr. Richards, she did remember that his given name was Charlie, had been a traveling man. Also, it was a long time ago. Mrs. Richards may have been a bit feeble-minded, but she possessed other qualities, such as a warm, loving, and open, very open, heart. She had 2 children by the evanescent Mr. Richards, and 2 children by 2 other gentlemen with whom she had been scrupulous not to commit bigamy, and was currently awaiting the birth in about 6 months of her 5th child, the father of whom she thought was most probably a young man named Curtis. Current social welfare policy held that it would be destructive to the family unit to suggest that Mrs. Richards, now or at any time, place her children in a day nursery and go out and labor for her and their bread. Consequently, she was supplied with a monthly check made up with city, state, and federal taxes. It cannot be said that the amount of the check was lavish, but Mrs. Richards did not demand very much and was easily satisfied. She had never been trained in any craft, trade, or profession, and if anyone was crude or unkind enough to suggest that she had enough skills required to manipulate a scrub brush and bucket, she would point out that when she did this, her back hurt her. The state of the floor of her apartment on the day when Mr. Mason came to call, at an hour nicely calculated with reference to the mail schedule, indicated that Mrs. Richards had not risked backache lately. After an exchange of greetings, Mr. Mason said, "If you've cashed your check, I've got the receipt made out." "I don't believe it's come," she said placidly. This was her routine reply. It was her belief that eventually it might be believed, although it never had been. Nor was it now. "If you spend the rent money on something else," Mr. Mason said, "I'll have to go down to the welfare and have them close your case." This was his routine reply. Curtis, in a peremptory tone, said, "Give the man his money." The prospect of approaching fatherhood had raised in him no tender sentiment. In fact, it raised no sentiment at all, other than an increasing daily restlessness and a conviction that it was time for him to move on. Without so much as a sigh, Mrs. Richards now produced an envelope from her bosom and examined it closely. "I guess it might be this one," she said. "I haven't opened it." Curtis, quite tired of every routine gambit of his lady love, now said quite testily, "Give the man his money." He wanted cigarettes, and he wanted whiskey, and he knew that neither of these could be had until the check was cashed. "If I got to hit you—" Mrs. Richards endorsed the check with her landlord's pen, and Mr. Mason began to count out her change. A new consideration now entered Curtis's mind, previously occupied only by the desire for cigarettes, whiskey, and moving on. It entered with such extreme suddenness that it gave him no time to reflect on it. He observed that Mr. Mason had a revolver in a shoulder holster inside his coat, and he observed that Mr. Mason's wallet was quite engorged with money. Curtis was not naturally malevolent, but he was naturally impulsive. He whipped Mr. Mason's revolver from its holster, struck Mr. Mason heavily on the side of the head with it, and seized his wallet. Mr. Mason went down, but he went down slowly. He thought he was shouting for help, but the noise coming out of his mouth was no louder than a mew. He was on his hands and knees by the time Curtis reached the door, and then he slid to one side and lay silent. Mrs. Richards sat for a moment in her chair. New situations were things she was not well equipped to cope with. After the sound of Curtis's feet on the stairs ceased, she continued to sit for some time, looking at Mr. Mason. Presently, a thought entered her mind. The familiar-looking piece of paper on the dirty table was a receipt for her rent. The money scattered around was the money Mr. Mason had been counting out to cash her check. His practice was to count it out twice, and then deduct the amount of the rent. Mrs. Richards slowly gathered up the money, slowly counted it, moving her lips. It was all there, and so was the receipt. Mrs. Richards nodded. She now had the receipt for her rent and the money. True, she no longer had Curtis, but then she knew he was bound to move along sooner or later. Men always did. She hid the rent money in one of the holes with which the walls of the apartment were plentifully supplied, and then reflected on what she had better do next. All things considered, she decided it was best to start screaming. Curtis went down the stairs rapidly, but once in the street he had sense enough to walk at a normal pace. Running men were apt to attract the attention of the police. 3 blocks away was a saloon he favored with his trade. He entered by the back door, causing a buzzer to sound. He tried to slip quickly into the men's room, but wasn't quite quick enough to escape the attention of the bartender-proprietor, an irascible West Indian called Jumbie, and no great friend of Curtis's. "Another customer for the toilet trade," said Jumbie, so loudly that he could be heard through the closed door. "I'd make more money if I gave the drinks away free and charged admission to the water closet." Curtis ignored this familiar complaint and emptied the wallet of its money, dropping the empty leather case into the trash container which stood, full of used paper towels, alongside the sink. Then he left. Police cars sped by him, their sirens screaming. Vague thoughts of cigarettes and whiskey still floated in Curtis's mind, but the desire to move on was by now uppermost. It was with some relief, therefore, that he saw a young man sitting in an open convertible. The convertible was elegantly fitted out, and so was the young man. His name was William. "You've been talking about going to California, William," Curtis said. "I've also been talking," William said with precision, "about finding some congenial person with money to share the expenses of going to California." Curtis said, "I hit the numbers. I got money enough to take care of all the expenses. Don't that make me congenial?" "Very much so," said William, opening the door. Curtis started to slide in, but William stopped him with a long, impeccably groomed hand which touched him lightly. "Curtis," he said in low but firm tones, "if you have something on you, I really must insist that you get rid of it first. Suppose I meet you here in an hour. That will also enable me to pack." "1 hour," Curtis said. He went into another bar, obtained cigarettes and whiskey. At the bar was a man generally, if not quite popularly known as The Rock. "How you doing, Rock?" Curtis inquired. The Rock said nothing. "Got some business to talk over with you." Curtis went on. The Rock continued to say nothing. "Like to take in a movie?" Curtis asked. The Rock finished his drink, set down the glass, looked at Curtis. Curtis put down money. Left the bar. The Rock behind him. He bought 2 tickets at the movie theater, and they went in. The house was almost empty. After a minute or two, Curtis whispered, $50 buys a gun. I got it on me." The Rock took out a handkerchief, spread it in his lap, counted money into it, passed it to Curtis. After a moment, Curtis passed the handkerchief back. The Rock soon left, but Curtis stayed on. He still had the better part of an hour to kill. The Rock took a bus and traveled a mile. He walked a few blocks on a side street and entered a house which, like most of its fellows, bore a sign that it had been selected for something euphemistically called urban renewal, and that further renting of rooms was illegal. Most of the windows were already marked with large X signs. On the second floor, the Rock disturbed a teenage boy and girl in close, though wordless, conversation. The boy looked up in some annoyance, but after a quick glance decided to say nothing. The girl clutched his arm until the intruder passed. The door on the third floor was locked, but the Rock pushed hard. Once. And it yielded. The room was ornately furnished, and the dressing table was crowded with perfumes and cosmetics and a large doll. But seated on the bed was a man. "It ain't you," the man said. He was red-eyed drunk. "It ain't me," the Rock agreed. "It's Humpty Slade," said the man on the bed. "He don't pay for her rent. He don't buy her no clothes. He don't feed her. I do." The Rock nodded his massive head. "Everybody knows that," the Rock said. He took a handkerchief out of his pocket, laid it on the bed, opened its folds. $75, he said. A quick turnover and a modest profit. That was the Rock's policy. The boy and girl, now seated on the stairs, shrank to one side as he came down. They did not look up. It was not very comfortable there in that all-but-abandoned house, but it was private as you can get when you have no place of your own to go. Upstairs, on the bed, the waiting man stared at the revolver with his red eyes. After a while, the boy and girl sauntered down into the street and went separate ways in search of something to eat. But after supper they met again in the same hallway. Scarcely had they taken their places when they were disturbed. A man and woman came up, talking loudly. They paused at the sight of the younger pair in the dim light of the single bulb, and for a moment the two couples looked at one another. The older woman was handsome, flamboyantly dressed, and made up. Her companion was large and on the ugly side, his looks not improved by a crooked shoulder which jutted back on one side. "What are you kids doing here?" he demanded. "Go on, get out!" "Oh, now, Humphrey," the woman pleaded, "you leave them alone. They ain't hurting nobody." "Okay, sugar," the big man said submissively. They continued up the stairs. The boy and girl listened as they fumbled at the door. Then the woman's voice went high and shrill with fear, screaming, "No! No! No!" At the loud sound of the revolver, the boy and girl leaped to their feet. Something fell past them and landed below with a thud. "You'd point a gun at me?" The man's voice growled. Then there was the noise of a blow. "My woman! You'd take a shot at me?" The sound of fist on flesh again and again. The boy and girl crept down the stairs. "No, Humpty, don't hit me anymore. I'm sorry, Humpty. I didn't mean it. Oh, please, Humpty, please." "Don't hit him anymore, honey. He was drunk, honey." The boy and girl stopped at the bottom floor for only a moment. Then they were gone. Curtis paused, uncertain. He was sure that it was dangerous for him to remain on the street, but he didn't know where to go. That little rat, William, had failed to reappear. There were planes flying and trains and buses running, but even if he decided what to take, he would still have to decide which airfield, which station, which terminal. The problems seemed to proliferate each time he thought about them. He would have a drink to help him consider. There wasn't really any hurry. That dirty rat, William. The Sepoy lords were holding an informal meeting, a caucus, as it were. Someone has remarked that the throne of Russia was neither hereditary nor elective, but occupative. The same might be said of office in the Sepoy lords. The scene was a friendly neighborhood rooftop. "So, you think you're going to be warlord?" a boy named Buzz demanded. "That's right," said the one called Sonny. The quorum, including several Sepoy ladies, listened with interest. "I don't think you're going to be warlord," said Buzz. "I know I am," said Sonny. "What makes you so sure?" inquired Buzz. "This," Sonny said simply, reaching into his pocket and taking something. Sudden intakes of breath. Eyes lighting up, members crowding around, loud comments of admiration. "Sonny got a piece! Look at that piece Sonny's got!" The president of the Sepoy lords, one Big Arthur, who had until now remained above the battle, asked, "Where'd you get it, son?" Sonny smirked, cocked his head. "She knows where I got it," he said. His girl, Myra, smiled knowingly. Buzz said only one word, but he said it weakly. He now had no case, and he knew it. The new warlord sighted wickedly down the revolver. "First thing I'm going to do," he announced. "There's one old cat I am going to burn. He said something about my old lady, and that is something I don't take from anybody, let alone from one of those dirty old ermine kings." Diplomatically, no one commented on the personal aspect of his grievance, all being well aware how easy it was to say something about Sonny's old lady, and being equally aware that the old lady's avenging offspring now held a revolver in his hand. But the general aspect of the challenge was something else. "Those ermine kings better watch out, is all," a Sepoy lady declared. There was a murmur of assent. Big Arthur now deemed it time to interpose his authority. "Oh, yeah, sure," he said. "They better watch out. How come? Because we got one piece?" Warlord Sonny observed a semantic inconsistency. With eyes narrowed, he said, "What do you mean, we? We haven't got anything. I'm the one who's got the piece, and nobody is going to tell me what to do with my personal property, see?" He addressed this caveat to the exuberant Sepoy lady, but no one misunderstood him, least of all Big Arthur. Allowing time for the message to sink in, Sonny then said, "Big Arthur is right. I mean, one ain't enough. We need money to get more. How? I got a plan. Listen. They listened. They agreed. They laughed their satisfaction. Now, Sonny concluded, let's get going. He watched as most of them filed through the door. He started after them, then stopped. Was stopped. Big Arthur seized his wrist with one hand and grabbed the revolver with the other. Sonny, crying, "Gimme that back!" leaped for it. But Big Arthur, taking hold of Sonny's jacket with his free hand, slapped him hard back against the door. "You got the wrong idea, son," Big Arthur said. "You seem to think that you are the president around here. That's wrong. Now, if you really think you are man enough, you can try to get this piece away from me. You want to try?" For a while, Sonny had been somebody. Now he was nobody again. He knew that he would never in a million years take the revolver away from Big Arthur, never burn that one old cat from the Ermine Kings who had said something about his old lady. Tears of pain and humiliation welled in his eyes. "Cheer up," Big Arthur said. "We're going to see how your plan works out, and it better work out good. Now get down those stairs with the other members, Mr. Sonny Richards." Head down, Sonny stumbled through the door. Myra started to slip through after him, but Big Arthur detained her. "Not so quick, chick," he said. "Let's move along together. You and me are going to get better acquainted." For just a second, Myra hesitated. Then she giggled. "Much better acquainted," Big Arthur said. Feeling neither strain nor pain, Curtis glided out of the bar. The late afternoon spread invitingly before him. He was supposed to meet somebody and go somewhere. William. There, slowly passing by in his fancy convertible, was the man himself. With great good humor, Curtis cried, "William!" and started toward him. William himself saw things from a different angle. Curtis, to be sure, was rough. But what had really set William against going to California with him was the fact that he had observed Curtis that way. He, William, wanted nothing to do at any time with people who carried guns, and anyway, he wasn't quite ready to leave for California. Something had come up. What came up at that moment was Curtis, roaring, so it seemed, with rage, and loping forward with murder in his eye. William gave a squeak of fright. The convertible leaped ahead, crashing into the car in front, and still Curtis came on. Screaming, "Keep away from me, Curtis!" William jumped out of the car and started to run. Someone grabbed him. "Don't stop me! He's got a gun! Curtis!" he yelled. But they wouldn't let go. It was the police, wouldn't you know it? Grim-faced men in plain clothes, of all the cars to crash into. One of them finished frisking Curtis. "Nope, no gun," he said. "This one ain't dangerous." "You," he turned to William. "What do you mean by saying he had a gun?" William lost his head and started to babble, and before he could move, the men were searching him and the car. They found his cigarette case stuffed with sticks of tea, and they found the shoebox full of it, too. "Pot," said one of them, sniffing. "Real Mexican stuff. Convertible, hey? You won't need a convertible for a long time, fellow." William burst into tears. The mascara ran down his face, and he looked so grotesque that even the grim faces of the detectives had to relax into smiles. "What about this one, Leo?" one of them asked, jerking his thumb. "He's clean." But Leo was dubious. "There must be some connection, or the pretty one wouldn't have been so scared," he said. A thought occurred to him. "What did he call him? What did you say his name was? Curtis?" The other detective snapped his fingers. "Curtis. Yeah. A question, Curtis. You in the apartment of a Mrs. Selina Richards today?" "Never heard of her," said Curtis, sobering rapidly. Move on. That's what he should have done. Move on. Mrs. Richards was entertaining company. The baby was awake, had been awake, in fact, since those chest-deep, ear-splitting screams earlier in the afternoon, and the girls had come home from school. She had sent them down to the store for cold cuts and sliced bread. They hadn't eaten more than half of it on the way back, and Mrs. Richards and the neighbors were dining off the other half. There was also some wine they had all chipped in to buy. Excitement didn't come very often, and it was a shame to let it go to waste. "Didn't that man bleed?" a neighbor exclaimed. "All over your floor, Selina." "All over his floor, you mean? He owns this building." After the whoops of laughter died down, someone thought of asking where Mrs. Richards' oldest child was. "I don't know where Sonny is," she said, placid as ever. "He takes after his daddy. His daddy always was a traveling sort of man." She felt in her bosom for the money she had placed there, the money she had taken from the hole in the wall after the police and ambulance left. Yes, it was safely there. All in all, she thought, it had been quite a day. Curtis gone, but he was on the point of becoming troublesome anyway. Excitement, a lot of excitement. Company in, hanging on every word, the receipt for the rent plus the rent itself. Yes, a lucky day. Later on she would see what the date was, and tomorrow she would play that number. If luck was coming to you, nothing could keep it away. They had taken 3 stitches in Mr. Mason's scalp, and taped and bandaged it. "You want us to call you a taxi?" the hospital attendant asked. "No," Mr. Mason said. "I don't have any money to waste on taxis. The bus is still running, isn't it?" "There's a charge of $3, the attendant said. Mr. Mason snorted. "I don't have 3 cents. I'll have to borrow bus fare from some storekeeper, I guess. That dirty... He took everything I had. Right in broad daylight. I don't know what we pay taxes for." "I guess we pay them to reward certain people for turning decent buildings into flophouses," the attendant said. He was old and crusty and due to retire soon and didn't give a damn for anybody. Mr. Mason narrowed his eyes and looked at him. "Nobody has the right to tell me what to do with my personal property," he said meanly. The attendant shrugged. "That's your personal property, too," he said, pointing. "Take it with you. We don't want it." It was the empty shoulder holster. On leaving the hospital, Mr. Mason headed first for a store, but not to borrow bus fare. He bought a book of blank receipts. He still had most of his rents to collect, and he intended to collect every single one of them. It hardly paid a person to be decent these days, he reflected irritably. One thing was sure. Nobody else had better tangle with him. Not today. He headed for the first house on his round, and it was there, in the hallway, that the Sepoy lords caught up with him.
So, what'd you think?
I really like this story. Um, as I kind of mentioned before, it's very much about the writing and the characters, but there's also, the plot is subtle, but it's there, and the structure, it's almost like, I know this is gonna sound sinister, but it's kind of like walking into a trap that you don't see until it's sprung, because it
Absolutely.
seems meandering and it seems
Mhm.
almost more just like this is the like he cuts out like a half a day or maybe three-quarters of a day in the life of this community to just kind
Mhm.
of show it for what it is. But then it just comes together at the end. And like you were comparing it to Ralph Bakshi, this I was thinking of like Robert Altman and some of
Ooh,
his movies,
absolutely.
where again it's just kind of this moment in time almost where there's not where there is structure there, but it's deceptive. Um, so that was kind of my first big impression. And the other thing that really jumped out at me is the voice. The there is this irony to it. And especially like describing Mr. Mason and like there's this kind of jaunty tone presenting him
Mhm.
as this good guy, but everything that he does is terrible.
It really feels it feels like Dickens writing about a character in a revolutionary tone from what
Yes.
I was checking.
Yeah.
It's such a wonderful way to introduce a character who does such a terrible thing to his community
Hmm.
and passes it off as philanthropic endeavors.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that um the community is not there are no angels in this story.
No.
Everybody is kind of terrible in their own way.
Hmm.
Um and yet I don't know how to explain it exactly. It's like it's a combination of just them kind of being greedy SOBs, but also they are products of the situation that Mason has contributed to.
Hmm.
And so, which kind of does lead into the end where he does get his comeuppance. And underneath it is this anger that's subtle, but it's there. Like it's that like anger at these people, anger at the situation that they are in, and maybe angry at their either their inability to see that they're in this situation or their kind of willingness to perpetuate the violence and degradation of the community that they live in instead of trying to make it better.
It really is that ending where Mason just refuses any reproach for his actions, and he goes, "Look, don't tell me what to do with my property.
Hmm.
I'll do what I want." You see so many times where people have the opportunity to make a better choice or do anything small in order to improve even morally, and they can't. Like you said, products of their environment, so they have to take that short-term gain or that
Hmm.
chance at improving their situation as fast as possible.
Yeah.
I really dig that organic nature of how that, even if it was 3 blocks, 5 blocks, that small chunk of the city, it, man, everything connects. Every finger connects to every toe in that one.
Yes.
I really dig it.
Yeah. Again, it's this trap that he kind of puts you
Hmm.
in.
Yeah.
It's incredibly impressive.
It lays out all of the threads, and then right in the last couple paragraphs, it just pulls it tight, and it's too late. You're already in it.
Hmm.
So how would you adapt a work based on Revolver? What would you do? A short film? Or I think there's enough here, despite its incredibly short length. It's only 6 pages and
Hmm.
6 half pages. I really think you could get a full hour-and-a-half film out of this.
I think you could. Like I might cut it down to like a lean 80 minutes.
I can see that, yeah.
But I like I was originally thinking short film and I was
Hmm.
thinking making it kind of Altman-esque again, like
Hmm.
that's kind of almost cinema verite style, documentary style, kind of rough 70s gritty New York style. I
Mhm.
think that could work really well. Or on the other hand, I think you could also go kind of big, like a little bit bigger and cartoony with it because
Mhm.
I was thinking of Walter Hill's The Warriors.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like again, and I think probably because I'm thinking New York 70s grittiness, where
Mhm.
I mean, The Warriors is it's this strange kind of mix of this, kind of comic booky sensibility with also this just grungy um, attitude about the lives of these people who are caught in this web of violence, and
Mhm.
they can't get out and maybe even don't want to get out. And so I think that to do that, you would probably have to add a little bit more, maybe especially with like the I forget the name of the street gang, but you might add a
Mhm.
little bit more of that. Like,
Oh yeah. I feel like a lot could be done with the Savoy Lords. They are really a really fun Russian street gang. You don't get those that much anymore. They used to be
no,
very prevalent in, in crime noir.
yeah,
But I think there's so much room for adaptation in Avram's work just because of how little he does in terms of the direct depiction of the setting. It's
hmm
very open, very free to let your mind wander. There was a story we did last month that was The Power of Every Root, that involved a policeman and an old wizard, or an old medicine man. And it so well described this small Spanish town versus this completely open to interpretation set of city blocks. And I love that.
yeah,
The ability to really let a an adaptationalist breathe. I think there's some serious meat here.
I do
But
too. And just there's room for expansion for each of the characters. Like and you wouldn't have to
mm,
do a whole lot, but um, it's it's so interesting just how their lives are intertwined, and the gun is this it's the thread that goes all the way through that ties it all together. It's like it could almost be like an anthology movie, like what's that Tim
mm,
Roth movie where he plays the bellhop? I think it's called Four Rooms or something like that.
mhm. I
Where
can't
again,
remember the title, but gosh, yeah, it sounds familiar.
yeah, where it's like it's the stories are separate, but they're all connected because of him as this character going from these different rooms in
Mhm.
the hotel. And so the gun kind of functions along the same lines. But then again, but at the end of it, it does again all come together. So you could
Mhm.
kind of do this weird medium between that.
I really like the idea of keeping that point of view character as the character with the revolver, and when it passes over, I mean,
Mhm.
there are so many creative shots that you can do with that.
Oh
Even a
yeah.
simple like shot reverse shot passing the revolver would be enough, and that would work. Ah, man, I think it's wild how I don't believe any of Avram's work has ever been adapted to the screen.
Yeah, not
Outside
that
of
I
wait,
know
I
of.
think one short film. I think one short film, but I can't remember off the top of my head. It would be on the site. Gosh. So you have any other thoughts?
The only other thought I could say, like when we're talking about adaptation, is like you could almost make the gun itself the actual protagonist, which would go along
Oh.
again with like the editing and the shots and things like that. Because
Mhm.
the gun is kind of emblematic of the revolver is emblematic of everything. It's emblematic of both Mason's power, but also his impotence.
Mhm.
And really that's kind of how it is for all of them. Like they get the gun, but it doesn't work out for anybody who gets it. It's this symbol of power, and it is an object of power because of its ability to inflict violence. But at the same time, everybody who gets it fails to use it. It
They
is,
all overstep their boundaries in a way that they think they're protected because they have this,
yeah,
and then it just they can never follow through.
no, they absolutely can't. The guy who his wife is cheating on him. Like you don't even see the scene, which I think is really interesting. You just hear like, you just pulled a gun on me, and then like the sounds of violence, and this man who's being cheated on, he is getting the tar beaten out of him.
Mm-hmm.
Or the son who's a part of the Russian street gang who's like, I got this and I'm gonna mess everybody up, and he has like this moment, almost literally a moment of respect, and then the head of the gang is just like takes it away from him. He's like, what are you gonna do about it, son? and and then of course it comes back and at the very end, and it's not shown, but Mason is obviously he's shot at the end of it. And so
Mhm.
there's something really interesting that he's saying about violence and the tools of violence, and how maybe that gives us a false sense of security when in fact it's just opening the door so that it will be visited upon us.
Mhm.
It's you don't, this is going to sound like a strange comparison, but this is just where my mind went. It's kind of like getting a Ouija board and then getting mad when the spirits come and mess with you.
Yeah.
You open the door. What did
Mhm.
you expect would happen?
I think the best part of that, if Mason had never bought the gun, none of that would have happened.
No, this just would have been an ordinary this just a regular day for all of them.
Absolutely. Well, it was lovely talking with you.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed this.
Absolutely. It was a wonderful time. I hope to see you back again at some point down the road with another story, maybe a Virgil.
I would love that. Thank you.
You have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Oh, I suppose God only knows. It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.